Right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined us for today's event, exploring the potential for arts, culture, and heritage to tackle gender and diversity in climate resilience and adaptation. We are streaming live as part of the COP26's Gender, Science, and Innovation Day. My name is Lata Narayanswamy, and I'm an associate professor in the politics of global development in the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. And I have the privilege of being the chair for this wonderful event being hosted by the Resilience Hub. Now, our session brings together colleagues who are engaged in tackling climate change with arts and humanities research. Much has been made, quite rightly, about the science, that is, that we must keep warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius if we are to avoid tipping points that will make the planet increasingly uninhabitable in many places. But are we going to be able to manage changes in the climate with just science? Our speakers today, I think I can safely presume, would answer with a resounding no. And quite rightly too. A key challenge, I feel, is to move away from the idea that our response to the climate emergency is all about the science. Our world is not a level playing field where people feel the effects of these changes equally. Climate change can only be tackled if we understand it as a fundamentally social problem, and indeed an effect of the system that we live within. And it reflects and entrenches and exacerbates existing intersectional inequalities along gendered, raced, and classed lines. Tackling these inequalities is integral to any climate action. So put simply, if we don't tackle these inequalities, then we fail. So today's speakers will be sharing insights from their own research that sheds light on how the arts and humanities can help to address the inequalities in ways that will support action on the climate emergency. So just as a reminder, this session aims to shed light on this topic based on the following objectives. So first, to raise awareness about the significance and vulnerability of social categories such as gender, race, and class in relation to the risk to climate change in different worldwide regions. Second, to highlight the opportunities for addressing climate resilience and adaptation through recognizing and exploring arts, culture, and heritage research and action that encompasses and embraces awareness of these social categories. Three, to explore ways in which arts, culture, and heritage can facilitate a better and inclusive conversation around social inequalities such as gender, race, class, and ethnicity in different places. And last but not least, to highlight opportunities for arts-based methods sensitive to these categories to also facilitate and support net zero research. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn over to our first presentation, which is the Filming Energy Research Network, or FERN. We're going to have a short film and a presentation on filmmaking that will be discussing how it's supported energy infrastructure decision making in low-income housing. And our first presenters on this topic will be Dr. Minna Sunika Blanc from the University of Cambridge and Adi Kumar who's a South African partner. Now, Dr. Sunika Blanc is Associate Professor and Deputy Head at the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge. Her current research uses documentary filmmaking as a method to understand women's everyday lives and energy use in low-income housing in India, Ethiopia, and South Africa. She is Director of Studies and Fellow in Architecture at Churchill College, Cambridge. Alongside Dr. Sunika Blanc, we have the pleasure of hosting Adi Kumar, who's a land and housing activist. His global experiences focus on informal settlement, upgrading, advocacy for land and housing rights, urban development policies, community organizing, and land value capture. He is the former director of Development Action Group, or DAG, and worked extensively with Slum Dwellers International and the United Nations.
I will introduce our research project that used film to understand the lived experience of women living in slum transition housing in Cape Town and Mumbai, and focusing on women's energy use. So I work in academia, but it's been a very exciting project because we work together with NGOs and policymakers, such as the city of Cape Town. Next slide, please. And the film is mainly the focus of my presentation because the whole project is about filmmaking, but just few words about the context. So by 2030, 40% of the world's population is likely to live in informal settlements. And this will mean that millions and millions of households will face this transition towards affordable housing with water and electricity access. So what we need to make sure is that this transition from informality to formality will happen in a way that it doesn't compromise the well-being of the inhabitants and also doesn't lead to unintended consequences in terms of lifestyle that become completely dependent on high energy use. Next slide, please. And the research question in our project was how energy access impacts on women's lives in low-income housing. And we became very interested in the project, how women could be empowered through energy. So when we started the project, COVID happened, but this turned out to be a bit of a silver lining, because rather than us as researchers going to the field, we actually recruited research participants from women living in the transition housing to do filming of their daily practices. And we give them certain instructions. So usually film cycle took 5 days at a time. They filmed every 3 hours and also 30-second clips at the time. So we collected all these clips and analyzed them and did it in several cycles of filming while giving feedback to the participants. And at the end of the project, all the participants got like acknowledgement of the participation. The next slide, please. And the film that I will show in a minute is focused on this Pickwick housing in an inner city location in Cape Town. In many aspects, it has been a very successful project. So it provides shelter for 39 households with communal kitchen and communal bathrooms and also water and electricity infrastructure. So what we were interested in is really like once this kind of housing project happens, what does actually go on behind the closed doors? How do people live and use energy? Next slide, please. And the project is still ongoing, but just very briefly, a few key findings that the films showed us. We did films in Mumbai, in slum transition housing, and also in Cape Town. And what was very important was that there is like huge importance of the cultural context. So even something simple like cooking practices differed enormously in Cape Town and Mumbai. And also the kind of technocratic energy policies often tend to assume that immediately when households get access to LPG or electricity, the time used on cooking, for example, reduces. But when we looked at the time of use of the households, that was definitely not the case. So in some cases, it even increased housekeeping standards. So for example, in SRA housing in Mumbai, despite the gas, the LPG access, some women, they still cook 3 to 4 times per day, putting in sometimes 56 hours of unpaid work just on cooking. And that was also, I think, like important lesson for us. So sometimes like the time of use does not necessarily correlate with what you would anticipate based on the energy access. So the next slide, please. And quite importantly, I think what can be learned from these housing projects is that a lot of domestic practices that before in informal settlements used to happen outdoors are now all thrown indoors. So for example, in this SRA housing in Mumbai, a lot of the housing units have only single aspect. So it means that all the windows open up to public access corridor, which you can see in this picture. So that means a lot of households keep the windows closed even when they are cooking. And this leads to all kinds of health problems, but also very high energy use because the households will need electric lights and become reliant on electric fans and in the future also air conditioning just to keep the space habitable because you don't have opportunities for cross ventilation. So I will put also in chat box links to the project website and also to the film that we did in Mumbai, including an animation that's available on BBC iPlayer, which tells the story of one woman moving from informal settlements to the SRA housing and her life in there. So the next slide, please. And just kind of as my final slide before the slide, what was really a revelation to myself in this project, because my background is more like on surveys, energy surveys and quantitative analysis, was how useful the filmmaking was in terms of understanding the materiality of homes, both in terms of appliances, the light condition. They were literally worth 1,000 words just in a very instant. The filmmaking also gave the participant an agency what they wanted to show, that rather than us as researchers intruding their space, and also they could use the whole body language to describe what they do, when they do things, how they use appliances, without having to put those actions into words.
This is now my favorite place where I want to be a whole day inside this room. I enjoy it here. I like to watch my TV or watching my soapies, but I think this is the best place where I can be.
Everything okay, my darling? Yes, it's open, Mr. Turner. Stay there. You're fine, honey. Coco, Saturday at 8 on E. There's no reason to believe you.
I never should have come here. I know that. This was all a big mistake. Like I told you, I'm not.
And how they perform in the Electoral College.
Quick last question. One commentator I heard say Americans aren't voting for Biden, they're voting for or against Trump.
What is this? I don't know. Where do you gonna write it all?
During the course of the first wave in Gauteng.
Dr. Marty, we know that the president did say this week that we won't go into
This shower, why I sleep here in this shower? This is my best place because I like to shower. To shower in the shower is very clean, and I'm thankful for. It's not my job to say
This is my base spot, the Wi-Fi spot, and the view. I can also show the.
And then we can take a stop and then up and down now.
This is my best place because I like to watch the cars driving. It's just the view, man. It's like
I think the whole place you can't even see over there. En is er maar aan mijn morgen. Je ziet profile, ze moet probably every people. Die nezen.
saddest part of Pickwick because why it's unhealthy and the kids love playing here. So it's just the buns, that's all.
That's it.
You're watching the people play, no?
Thanks, Minna, for that fantastic video and presentation. So just to build on what Minna was explaining earlier, the families that were living in the Pickwick transitional housing emerged out of one of the many informal settlements that exist in Cape Town. Currently, there's an estimate of anywhere between like 250 to 400 informal settlements in Cape Town that currently have emerged as a consequence of both apartheid spatial planning, exacerbated by urbanization and subsequently by climate change. So in many ways, the families that we saw lived in some of the most destitute conditions that we've seen in the inner city in Cape Town. Families not being able to have any access to basic services, sanitation, and so on. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's truly emerged as a result of kind of climate change and urbanization has been this issue of access to basic services. People struggling to have access to water, access to sanitation. And with the changing climate, what's really been pushed forward is the issue of dignity. So many people are living in undignified conditions, in poor shelter conditions, in extremely dense situations, unable to kind of like make the kind of everyday livelihood, everyday kind of survival, making it very complicated. So what we're seeing, particularly in a Cape Town context, is a significant growth in the number of community-led protests. I think about 10 years ago, it was estimated that there were two protests every month. Currently, there are about 2 protests every week, and often going up to 2 protests every day. So the frustration amongst people not being able to have adequate shelter, adequate access to services, to water, sanitation, and obviously this is compounded by the fact that they experience both natural hazards, but also man-made risks that emerge as a result of climate change and urbanization. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've learned while working with MINA and many other academic institutions, but also is this idea of using community-based data as a key instrument towards development planning. A very instrumental moment in my own kind of developmental thinking has been working in informal settlements and slums, where I was involved in many slum upgrading processes. And in those particular processes, learning that a lot of the work that we were doing was related to adaptation. So a lot of the instruments that we use in terms of working with communities and community-centered planning has really been focused on figuring out the ethics and the ways of working in which academic partners, the public sector, government itself, etc., interact with communities and work with them to develop solutions. So using technical skills, using other skills, but in a particular way that allows the community voice to be surfaced and realized in the development planning process. Next slide, please. So these particular processes of working with communities and participating with community obviously gets highly complicated and magnified in areas of high density, particularly in inner city, where land markets are extremely expensive and exclusionary. And as a result, many of the working class people living in inner city, particularly in Cape Town and many other cities across global south, as well as in global north, experience and face a degree of exclusion where they're unable to afford to live in the inner city, and often ruptures the fabric, the cultural fabric, and the fabric under which people exist, and the social networks, the economic networks, and so on. So very much what happened in Pickwick was a result of the fact that as it was becoming difficult for people to reside in the inner city, they were being forced to live in the periphery of the city, which was creating an environment which was leading to definitely sprawl, but also adding to the issues of climate change and all of those pieces. So in many ways, the issue of public participation and working with communities is really the center in which a lot of responses around culture, heritage can be responded in the face of a changing climate. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done, Lata. So just to kind of like takeaways from my side, so building on what Mina presented earlier, there are no shortcuts in terms of the community development processes. There's a whole process of entry, exit, working with communities, sustaining these relationships, having a mutual learning and a shared benefit process in any of those engagements and those developmental processes. The fundamental of any of these development processes and engagements, particularly with non-state actors, is really around working and utilizing a capability and ethics-based approach. We've encountered many instances where ethical issues are transgressed as a result of working with communities, which becomes highly extractive rather than being contributing towards their development. And then finally, of course, like many other developmental processes, it's inherently political. And in many ways, understanding the politics, both from state actors, non-state actors, as well as from NGOs, is critical in being able to understand how to address socio-cultural erosion in the face of a changing climate. Thanks, Lata.
Thank you, Mina and Adi. That's been fantastic. Such a richness of in your presentation in such a short space of time. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to now invite Dr. Pat Noxolo to share with us her research. Pat is a senior lecturer in human geography in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham. Her research brings together the study of international development, culture, and insecurity, and uses post-colonial discursive and literary approaches to explore the spatiality of a range of Caribbean and British cultural practices. So her recent work has focused on re-theorizing Caribbean insecurities, theorizations of space in Caribbean literature, Caribbean laughter and materialities, and rethinking the decolonial city and African Caribbean dances embodied mapping. So Pat is the lead researcher on the Caribbean Insecurities and Creativity, or CARISC research network, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. She's also chair of the Society for Caribbean Studies, co-editor of Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, and secretary of the Race Group of the Royal Geographical Society. So Pat, over to you.
I'm having my slides put forward by Lauren, so I'll need to just tell her when to advance them. So please advance it now, please, Lauren. Great. All right, so what I would like to talk with you about today is a project called Clare Cook. So I was introduced as the lead researcher on CARISC, which was my previous project, but I'm actually now leading a project called Clare Cook, which stands for Creative Approaches to Race and Security in the Caribbean and the UK. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. I want to tell you about the concept of Caribbean securities, and then just wrap up with some preliminary messages that we put into a learning pack for schools. Next slide, please. All right, so we've developed this idea of Caribbean insular securities in my previous project, CARISC, which was a Leverhulme-funded international network, and we have a special issue in Small Acts. The piece that I wrote was based on Erna Brodber, her novel Nothing's Matt, which is a beautiful novel. If you get a chance to read it, I definitely recommend it. So the idea of insular securities is that we're not just thinking about security as an anti-terrorism measure. We want to broaden out to think about environmental insecurity, livelihood insecurities, and gendered insecurities, for example. So this is the century of insecurity and security. This is a time to think about security in a much larger way. We want to think then beyond the bargains that populations make between security and freedom. It's not just that, it's about that kind of balance between security and insecurity. And I'm sort of insisting on that because actually the negotiation between different forms of security and insecurity, and between security and insecurity themselves, is an everyday practice. And those who are, as Adi described, in very precarious situations actually spend a lot of their time on this balance. So different people tend to prioritize different insular securities. Depending where you are, you'll notice different ones. And it's probably true to say also that one person's security measure can actually exacerbate another person's insecurity. So it's perspectival. What kind of interests me in particular is that this balance between security and insecurity is an area of creative practice. And we see this very much in the Caribbean. People use their creativity, their music, their dance, their singing, everything that they've got in order to really balance between security and insecurity. They're never completely secure, they're never completely insecure. They're putting in really creative practice day by day to maintain that balance. Next slide, please. All right, so let me tell you about Clare Cook. Clare Cook is called Creative Approaches to Race and Insecurity in the Caribbean and the UK. If you want to know more about Clare Cook, we've been very much an online project because we're a one-year project, so it's all been during lockdown and coronavirus. So the website is very important. If you want to know anything more about Clare Cook, everything is up there, clarecook.co.uk. And we're on Twitter and Instagram, of course. We're one of 10 engagement fellowships that the Arts and Humanities Research Council is funding this year. So they're EDI engagement fellowships, equality, diversity and inclusion. Next slide, please. The project has been in 3 parts, 3 stages during the year. The first stage has been the provocation stage. And so what we wanted to do was to get people to think about security and insecurity, and particularly in relation to climate change, which is a huge issue for the Caribbean at the moment. And obviously, you know, Caribbean participants at COP26 have been really clear about this. So we've had 3 artistic provocations during our project. The first by Annalie Davis, Walking Old Lands, Drawing New Lines. The second by Marsha Pierce, who's based in Trinidad, which was a Caribbean Insecurities exhibition. And the third by Sonia Barrett, which was an original installation called Dreading the Map. I'll talk through each of those now a bit more slowly. So next slide, please. So the first film by Annalie Davis, who was based in Barbados, was a film about the artificiality of the Barbadian landscape. And she looks at the Barbadian landscape to think about the Plantationocene or the Anthropocene, the ways in which the sugar industry was exploited the landscape, and how the landscape is now reasserting its own agency, the growing of herbs and medicinal plants, many of which can be traced back to enslaved people planting food for their own needs, and also medicinal herbs for their own needs. So Annalie Davis is an artist whose practice recognises those transnational connections between the UK and Caribbean islands, and how those have shaped the environment. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So that was our first provocation. Our second provocation was an exhibition, which, as I say, is still up on clarecook.co.uk, where we brought together 6 Caribbean artists. Marsha Pierce curated the exhibition. Marsha is based at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad. There were artists that were brought together with different styles and with different topics, but with a shared sense of in/security. So some were looking at environmental damage, pollution, and also from mass tourism in the Caribbean. Some were thinking about sexuality and identity. Others were thinking about post-colonial identities, such as Indo-Caribbean identities. Some were thinking about social media and the ways in which that spreads fear, and others were thinking about maroon identities, historical identities, and post-enslavement. So lots of different ideas about what we might mean by security and insecurity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you go back? Thank you. All right, so this is our original piece that was commissioned by Clare Cook. The artist Sonia Barrett, who's the one that you can see standing up there. This was completely her idea. It's called Dreading the Map, and there's a whole sort of process to this as an installation. So you can see us as a group of Black women sitting in the Royal Geographical Society. If any of you know the Royal Geographical Society, you'll know that that already is quite an unusual thing, that there's a group of Black women sitting in that building. We were shredding maps of the UK, of the US, of the Caribbean, and of Africa. And then we were plaiting those maps together. And that was one way in which we were rethinking the relationships between distance and proximity, bringing those places together using black hair techniques. So very accessible, collaborative process. It wasn't just we, but there were also many other people who were involved in the maplectic, as Sonia called it. And then Sonia would dread and twist the plaits together into the installation that you can just see peeking out at the top. Next slide, please. So this is what the installation looked like in the end. It's in the map room of the World Geographical Society, which is a very important and significant site. This was a room from which many explorers, colonial explorers, went out to do research and brought back their research during the colonial period. And so this is an anti-colonial installation. It's light. It leaves no marks in the building. It looks like water or smoke, very elemental. So it brought in lots of environmental concerns, was very highly suggestive as an installation. It's in dialogue with the oil paintings, which are, as you can see, lone white men standing in imperial positions. But it's also very collaborative piece of work, very dialogical also with the space, very generous in its relationship with the space. It doesn't refuse the space, it works with it. Next slide, please. So we can see in close-up what happens, that process of bringing places together, plaiting and twisting. You can see then that you end up with sort of sea next to urban landscape, next to kind of African ports, next to kind of British streets. So there's a lovely kind of sense of that, of juxtaposition, but also twisting and turning, that globalization is not about clean lines, nor is it about easy encounters. Next slide, please. Coming out of Dreading the Map, Gennaro Ambrosino made a film which teases out a range of different perspectives that went into this collaborative process. Next slide, please. I'm sorry I'm whizzing along really quickly, but just quite a lot to get through. So for each of the three provocations, we had an online event where we were able to bring lots of people into conversation online from many different places across the world. And also we had a curated audience who were very engaged, asked questions and followed us all the time along all the three of those events. The recordings of those events are still online, which you can access via clarecook.co.uk. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so not much more. The participation stage is the second stage of the project. And what we've done with that, we collaborated with the World Geographical Society, with the Geographical Association, with an anti-racist organisation called MA Education Consultancy, led by Muna Abdi, with the University of Birmingham as well. And we brought together all those people to make a learning pack for Key Stage 3 geography, which will be rolled out to schools after the project is finished. Next slide, please. The most important thing to me about the learning pack has been bringing together people to consider these issues. So we worked with student teachers who were thinking about the pedagogical resources available, particularly thinking about how they could use artwork or we could use artwork in the classroom. And that was really interesting. They trialed some of our work. And then we also worked with established teachers. And this, you can see Muna Abdi here. She led a sort of anti-racist conversation, talking about difficult conversations and how we can have those conversations in classrooms. Next slide, please. This is what the learning pack looks like online. We've got lots of exercises, and you can see that we're encouraging young people to interact with Dreading the Map and to think about the ideas that it raises. Next slide, please. So the third stage of the project, which we're in now, is called the transformation stage. We're making 3 films and a prototype publication. We're actually doing a lot. When we count it like this, I feel like this year has just been a real kind of conveyor belt of wonderful kind of action. You can see on this slide the 2 other members of the Clare Cook team, a postdoctoral researcher, Tia Monique Uzor, and a postgraduate researcher, Rita Gale. So we brought together the wonderful skills that they brought to the project in media and in dance to make very different types of creative product and practice. All right, so next slide, please. I want to just finish by thinking about the preliminary messages that we're trying to put over in the Clare Cook learning pack. So the sorts of learnings that we've had during the project. Next slide, please. Okay, 2 minutes, Latta says, so I think I can do that in time. So we've been thinking about how race is an in/security. So we've been thinking about, as I said, climate change. We've been thinking about how when people have more money, they're able to balance between security and insecurity more easily. But those with fewer resources need more agency, actually not less, to be able to balance, to keep that balance in their lives. Race is a source of security for many people, identity and belonging, but also insecurity, of course, because of racism and exclusion. So it is an in/security. Next slide, please. So we've been trying to help people to think about the UK and the Caribbean as a shared space. And this is one way of thinking about globalization, how we share the planet and therefore how we need to work together. And the idea of shared space comes from Milton Santos, who was a Brazilian geographer. So views on race in the UK, we want to emphasize that they have a very long history. Racist views have developed since enslavement over centuries, and they're going to take time and real effort to struggle against. Not that we have a lot of time, but we need to take that time. So views on race in the UK come out of a transnational relationship, a shared cultural heritage, where inequalities are baked into the system, but we need to directly challenge them there. Next slide, please. The climate crisis then is a result of extractive, colonial and capitalist plantation cultures. If you like, the climate crisis comes out of forms of racism. So we have to address racism if we want to make adequate global relationships that can combat climatic and environmental change. And this is with an emphasis on the fact that we are small islands. The UK and the Caribbean islands are small islands, and we're facing the same challenges, in particular sea level rise. So there's a particular imperative for UK geography, which is becoming more diverse as more young people recognise the issues. We need to be more attuned to diverse young people and their sense of urgency, rather than retreating into skills-focused complacency. Next slide, please. So how can educational establishments deal with this? Well, we need to have negotiation between education institutions and Black communities, teach our young people to have more than basic literacies through geography education. We need to relate and listen to different perspectives, demonstrate that all young people have a place in the world. That's really important. And we need to be creative in our transformation of curriculum and approaches, really have a creative conversation with each other and in particular with Black communities. Next slide, please. So I want to finish with this slide because this is Sonia Barrett, the artist, and you can see, I hope that you can see how her installation is moving in the space. It looks as if it's moving in the space, and it looks as if it's reaching out to her, and she's kind of standing determinedly in that dialogue. I think that's a really important kind of image for me of what we need to do in geography as a discipline and what we need to do all together as academics and activists in relation to climate change.
Amazing the amount of work you've been doing. That sounds like it's been a very busy year. But also just the richness of your presentation and so much for us to think about. And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm really rather desperate to get to that art installation in person. I mean, it looks quite nice on the screen. I imagine it's quite dramatic in person. So maybe that's the next thing on my bucket list. So thank you so much for that, Pat. That's been fantastic. Now I'd like to invite Professor David Swan, last but not least, who will be talking to us about his UKRI GCRF research on life-saving lullabies, maternal health lullabies featured in case study on arts and culture for net zero resilience. And Professor David Swan is a professor in design at Sheffield Hallam University. He is a double graduate of the Royal College of Art, His design research is grounded in the principles of subtraction and global healthcare challenges. In 2014, David won the International Council of Societies of Industrial Design's World Design Impact Prize for his ABC syringe and was selected to participate in the UK's inaugural Great Festival of Creativity, a showcase for British innovation. In 2020, the Life-Saving Lullabies team won a Best in Class award for social impact in the Good Design Australia Awards. So over to you, David. Thank you.
My presentation is in 3 parts. Part 1 and part 2 is really sharing with you the voices of young mothers and also the voices of St John Zambia, the service provider and partner of the kind of project. And it's important that you hear those voices rather than an academic. And then we're going to sort of finish off the presentation with 1 or 2 slides with some key takeaways and lessons in terms of what we learned about the kind of project. So before I begin to sort of play the first film, I think it's apt in terms of Calvino's essay of lightness, the point of intersection we're here at the moment in terms of the project itself operated during COVID, and it demonstrated the heaviness of our approach. And hopefully we can find a kind of a new approach where lightness is at the center of it. So if anybody wants any more information on the project, please get in touch. So Lauren, could you play the first film, please?
Ineshina ndine bwanjira mwankomesha njikala kwa kapira kwete 21 years. Story and pakuti njingire muri project ya Lullaby. Na research tako miscarriage. Nduna kwete fumo. Alisabitira omwana na 7 months. So kupitira kwa mwana kwa pitire. Okay. Sha umfirepo peni iliyonso kubukali kuti ngumfatira mbiri masaini yashana leo mfafi mmalafira mrekalipa pakusamu kufika kuma 04 ona ingire mbafa na dabafe mwana efe afumine efe afere kwe mwana mbafa afere ninshina afakali so na isa afumina pansi mshakwitepo na makana ilefe ndekala wantu na kufika mveranda fena ikere anti kwa isa kwa churuchero bayishira abantu paka batoro umwana uri abashikana abantu ana kukayosha kuri ku kliniki efe bampimina ta alife bwino tapali problem iri yonse ishere mumala so bayisa nje batukesa again futhi ku kliniki funa ile ku kliniki fetu yengena muri project
kwalangala kwalesa tampo mwana kwalangala kwalesa tampo mwana kwalangala kwalesa
kwalangala kwalesa tampo mwana kwalangala kwalesa napenga ne mwanaku kwalangala kwalesa tampo mwana kwalangala kwalesa ane bondereku kwalangala kwalesa.
Nyimbo shetuimba tulanda mwefe akwe bati ngaumpo mtu wakalipa ufire waku kliniki kubleedinga ufire waku kliniki ngaona ukwatefu moto ufire kwikala fye kunganda ufire waku kliniki
tampo mwana kwalangala kwalesa napenga ne mwanaku kwalangala kwalesa ane bondereku kwalangala kwalesa.
Project ya Lullaby ifyo because ine ali stako kwino bali ifuna letu nkanya pamwana ule wafire bali nomba nalira banokulaba shibukisha nokwivukisha kuti fye atike fye ali vyaso bali no Stephen tikana ndikala fye kwino nale sadi njasukali mpira nefumo na limbi iyo mpeta pa yakwe bati no tulimbo tatu no tonsambirira ndamwimbira no mwana oli mumana naye ndo mfoto mwana wanje apa ale umpa because kanga ndeimba ndamuka na malala sunkana isho na mwana wanje alifi buno mala.
Globally, but in particular in Zambia, our maternal and child health mortality rates and even our burden of disease in terms of maternal and child health are actually still quite high. And therefore there's still a great need to try and tackle and improve and lower some of those rates.
Our target group, who are the adolescents, which range from 15 to 21 years. They get pregnant while they are in schools, they get devastated. Most of them, they fear going to the health facility. So instead, we identify these volunteers who go out in the community.
Twaikote basi magina ifa baisa mukutusambilisha shireni nga basafye baisa mukutintandalira panganda bamsambilisha okusoma mlimulana bayinza then bamimbira kuno tulingo
cholinga choyimbira wana tumanyimbo chibweresa chimvano pakati kamwana ndi mai.
Singing benefits one in so many ways. It has been discovered that and proven that even singing to an unborn child, it even helps the communication, and that's where the bonding starts from.
So balisambisha kufya kumbira mwana paya ngali mumala. Anaikane mwena mukumuimbira mwana wanga uli mumimba.
Mwana wanga nikukonda, mwana wanga uli mumimba, mwana wanga nikukonda. Nifuna ukabadwe mushe, mwana wanga nikukonda, mwana wanga uli mumimba, mwana wanga nikukonda.
Akwata nokusekerea nawe na applaud na mumalamuti.
Some of the songs they composed, more especially like the volunteers, they were educative songs, such as family planning, danger signs, what they do on a daily basis at a health facility.
You know, our young people love to sing, and you know, I think it's one of those strategies that we find works with the young people. And I think it's helped to bring them on board. And it also, I think, has helped our staff in the clinics to deal with the adolescents a little bit better. Yes, we don't always want our adolescents to be mothers. We don't really want teenage pregnancies and things, but when they're already in the situation of motherhood, I think it's one way of helping them to understand that we do accept that they're in this situation.
It has given the adolescents the confidence to speak on their own. The booking of ANC, more especially for the adolescent, has increased. Uptake of family planning has also increased with the knowledge of sexual reproductive health.
We've actually seen that a lot of our mothers that we are working with do come to deliver at the facilities. They're able to cope better with their babies once they're born. And so we see less maybe malnutrition. It's had an impact. It's brought some families together. Testimonies of mothers saying, look, my husband now sings with me. I think it's been a very enlightening project. Yeah, so I think we look forward to seeing the next step up from lullabies to better outcomes in our maternal and child health programs.
So we began this project with a simple research question, which is, what's the potential for educational lullabies to become a responsive, zero-cost maternal child health intervention in Zambia? And we were fortunate that the University of Huddersfield managed to support some foreground research, where myself and my co-I, Jim Reed, who's with us today, were able to go out and to develop the project in conjunction with St John Zambia. Next slide, please. And this is the team, and we should acknowledge the amazing work that St John Zambia did, and also the 194 volunteers who produced these creative outputs that led to the success of the project. And also during the time of COVID, the need to bring on new partners to change our strategy, and that included Informal Films, who produced some of the films you've seen this evening. Next slide, please. Our approach from the outset had sustainability in mind, and we were very aware of past practices of research projects going into low and middle income countries, And once the project finished and the funding dried up, the whole thing just evaporates and crumbles. So we prioritize legacy from the outset. And with a kind of developed methodology, with complexity, it's usually the simplest of things that have the greatest traction. And with our concept of using lullabies as a vehicle for communicating educational messages and also messages around health and well-being for mothers, not only is it zero cost, it's also net zero as a solution. Next slide, please. I guess the key positive thing for us is that COVID demonstrated the heaviness of our research approach and study design. Our project started in March, just before lockdown in the UK, and we always knew that this approach would be adaptable and responsive to the local needs and priorities of mothers and groups. And at the very beginning, we charged the volunteers to create 2 songs around coronavirus to raise awareness in their communities. And they produced these songs and started to sing these songs even before there was a recorded case in Zambia. Because of COVID, the UK team adopted a kind of an intimacy without proximity approach, which naturally decarbonized the study design. It also meant that St John Zambia led the field work, creative workshops, the 2-centre pilot, with support and mentorship from the wider team. It also, back in February, March, as part of our dissemination plan, we were originally going to host an international symposium, but because of COVID rates in Lusaka, we were prevented of doing so. So we reimagined our strategy, and this brought on new partners in Fulu Films, and we produced a series of 6 or 7 films as part of our output. Final slide, please. So I guess the lessons that we've learned along the way, we've moved from heaviness to a lightness. We've really reinvigorated and applied an accepted cultural heritage tool to a current local and global challenge. The lightness of the tool and the intervention enabled non-professionals to actually care, to take ownership of their local communities. They produced 31 songs ranging from, as it said in the film, family planning to the danger signs in pregnancies, songs about loss and bereavement, and positive messages for young mothers as well. And critically, there were songs produced and written and performed by women for women. I guess the key thing for about frugal interventions, I guess that approach, it becomes a kind of disruptive force where it begins to sort of unite the needs of people, the planet, and also culture. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Those films are incredible. Yeah, I think I was watching that, just hoping that they would go on a bit longer. They just, again, just had the way in which the women that you were engaging with were talking about the value of that intervention for them. That's quite inspiring. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I think what I'd like to do now is to just share some thoughts that have occurred to me as I've been watching all of these fantastic presentations, because one of the things that I think is really valuable about the way we're thinking about these issues is whether we can think through how these projects help us to know the world differently, and then what does this mean for tackling the climate emergency. So I think we can start, and I think so what I've done is tried to bring together some ideas that cut across the presentations in different ways. So I think these presentations have helped us to understand that we can start by recognizing that the system that we live in has produced this climate crisis. So we must recognize that the same system is unlikely to produce the solutions without a holistic rethink. I think the presentations today have also highlighted for us the importance of considering historical influences. So things like taking account of colonialism, apartheid, the political and economic settlements and associated governance systems that have ensued from those settlements, where extractive capitalism sits at the heart of the climate crisis that underpin a lot of those historical trajectories and then shape the way that we live now. I think the other thing that today's presentations have highlighted for us quite forcefully is that technocratic approaches are just not on their own, able to take account of lived realities. And then here, arts and humanities research and the participatory methodologies that all of our presenters in different ways have highlighted, that the use of creative arts can reveal hidden challenges. I think what also has come clear today is that taking account of inequalities is not an optional extra, but integral to how we might understand our relative success or failure in how we manage climate change. So I think this sort of does go back to the comment I made at the beginning. If we don't deal with inequality, we are almost by definition going to fail at climate mitigation and addressing the climate emergency. There are also some interesting things emerging here about our vocabulary. So when we use arts and humanities research, how can we widen our understanding of the language that we use? And that tends to be in very narrow ways. So for instance, the language of security, how we think about space. So what sorts of approaches to change do we arrive at if we have a wider understanding of these sorts of terminologies? So for instance, with Pat, your presentation, you talked about security. When we reimagine what security might mean and to whom, how does that open up new possibilities for new types of change processes and approaches to emerge? We can also here then think about the notion of space. Who gets to occupy space and how is that space occupied? And in here, I'm interested in particular about the inclusion and exclusion dynamics. One of the things that I think has come out again quite forcefully across all the presentations is that the methods that have been used really get to the heart of who gets to be a part of these research spaces and then any results and outcomes. And then in using these methods, those dynamics have changed. So now all of a sudden, new people are included in the dialogue. We're learning new things. And the arts and humanities as both subject knowledge and a methodological approach are opening up those new opportunities for different types of engagement. What's also been really clear to me is that we're thinking through how we can consider questions of identity and belonging. So whether that's in relation to poverty, related notions of precarity, race and gender, but as importantly, or if not more importantly, how these sorts of categories are not distinct, but rather overlapping. So I think in this way, we can think carefully then about how all the projects that have been presented today help us to know the world differently. And then the implications of that knowledge and that new way of thinking about that knowledge for how we might tackle the climate emergency. The other thing that I want to draw our attention to then is methods, because one of the things about all of the presentations today that just really stood out is that our starting point here has been that the research, including in thinking about how we address climate crisis, is that research is both relational and political. And there are certain things that have emerged out of this. So the first thing that's striking for me across all of these projects is that all of our researchers here today have worked in partnership. And I just think this has come across really powerfully. Academia needs to be a part of thinking through what we might call solutions, but those answers don't come alone. We can use different techniques like mapping that allows us then to think about who is using space and how we understand the diversity of experiences in those spaces. There's opportunity here then in our methods to widen our indicators. So what again has come across in everyone's research is what does it look like when we try to widen our understanding of notions like well-being? And where does that get us in terms of how we understand people's lived realities? The other theme that seems to have come through in terms of methods has been about ethics. So the ethics that help us to reflect on the ways that we work with a wide range of stakeholder interactions. And here one thing really stands out, because I think the ethical questions have infused all elements of the research practice. And this takes us away from the tendency in lots of higher education practice to sort of see ethics as something that very narrowly fits in the field. I'm struck by the way all of our presentations today talked about the sort of the life cycle of the research and the ethical implications of every stage, including their own positionality as researchers throughout the lifetime of the project. And I think that's giving us new ways of thinking about the ethics of our research practice, which I think we should be thinking about more carefully. Other things that have struck me in terms of methods, sort of thinking about music, dancing, singing, artistic installations. And here it takes us back to this question of what it means for us to embrace cultural heritage and difference as a source of knowledge and fundamental to how we conceptualize change processes, rather than something that needs to be neutralized or explained away in the name of objectivity, which is very often the way that we're encouraged to think about our research. We're sort of neutral bystanders, and then we step back, and research is something that's happening in the field with other people that's not about us. I think what's striking for me in today's presentations is how integrated our researchers have been as part of their projects. The other thing about the methods I wanted to highlight here is, of course, the adaptations to COVID. And what's been really revealing about this is that we're learning new ways of working. And in some ways, it's allowing us to reimagine and even challenge the inbuilt hierarchies of our research. And what it seems to have enabled is more co-production and engagement by breaking down researcher and researched or informant dichotomies. And this seems really valuable because, in a way, I think arts and humanities research can be at the center of that less hierarchical, more inclusive approach to research. And going back to David's point about sort of the lifespan of research, how do we think about that sustainability beyond the research cycle? What strikes me is that what we have here are different methods that have helped us to link theory to practice, but also to make the most of online spaces. And indeed, our event today is evidence of how we can widen participation. Obviously, the proviso here being that internet access is also unequal around the world. But I have also been struck that by the way we've adapted to COVID and all the people that have been brought into the online spaces that maybe we would struggle to meet in person. And here then I'd want to just end by bringing all of these ideas together to then think about how we know how these arts and humanities approaches both help us to know the world differently, and then the methods that they introduce lead to new perspectives. So how can we think about our research as sustainable? How can we bring the question of whether we can decarbonize, new kinds of enabling environments, new diversified partners that we can bring into our researchers in a way that actually help us in a more nuanced way to think about the inequalities that are a part and parcel of how we're going to tackle climate crisis. So I think I'd like to just thank all of our presenters today for their absolutely fantastic presentations and the richness of the discussion that has emerged. And it's been a wonderful event. It's been a real privilege to be the chair. Our hosts have been Praxis at the University of Leeds on behalf of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and in collaboration with the Resilience Hub. So thank you all for coming. Good night.